You're listening to WEOPAM 730, the voice of inquiry. It's time to join Naomi Bishop for Persuasion Mechanics.
Welcome back. I'm Naomi Bishop. We're continuing our examination of how doing your own research functions once method is removed. Let's continue. People say it sincerely. Do your own research. It sounds responsible, independent, almost civic-minded. And often, it is said with good intent. Curiosity isn't the problem here. Questioning isn't the problem. Skepticism isn't the problem. What changed isn't why people look for answers. It's what the word research now refers to when they do. For most of its history, research described a method, a structured way of testing claims against reality, a process that imposed limits, standards, and resistance. Today, the word is often used very differently. It frequently describes exposure, watching, reading, scrolling, listening. The activity looks busy. The effort feels real, but the meaning has shifted. Research no longer points to a method. It points to content consumption. That distinction matters more than it first appears, because research, properly understood, isn't defined by how much information someone encounters. It's defined by what happens to a claim once it's encountered. At its most basic level, research involves a question that can be examined, a claim that can be tested, a process that subjects that claim to evidence, and accountability to what that evidence shows, even when it resists expectation. None of that requires volume. None of that requires certainty. All of it requires constraint. Content, by contrast, has no such obligation. Watching isn't investigating. Reading isn't testing. Collecting isn't evaluating. Content can support research. It often does, but content alone does not become research simply by accumulation. The difference is not subtle once it's seen, but it's easy to miss in practice. Because the modern information environment quietly trains a substitution. Search engines make information feel complete. Feeds make repetition feel like confirmation. Video makes confidence feel like explanation. Social reinforcement makes familiarity feel like consensus. Access becomes confused with understanding. And over time, exposure begins to stand in for method. This is why the experience feels legitimate. Effort still exists. Time is still spent. Patterns still form. Volume feels like depth. Repetition feels like verification. Confidence grows, not because ideas are being challenged, but because they aren't. Nothing pushes back. When research functions as a method, resistance is built in. When research becomes consumption, resistance disappears. And when resistance disappears, so do standards. Once standards are gone, there's no longer a shared way to evaluate claims, no common ground for deciding what counts as evidence, no consistent way to tell the difference between investigation and persuasion. This is just the first failure in the chain, because when standards disappear, authority doesn't vanish. It relocates. When research becomes content consumption, there is no longer a shared way to evaluate claims, no agreed method, no common criteria for evidence. But people still need to decide who to listen to. That decision doesn't stop being made. It just stops being anchored to process. Authority is often imagined as something that belongs to institutions, experts, credentials, systems. But authority, functionally, is much simpler than that. Authority is whoever is believed without verification. It isn't about who is right. It isn't about who is moral. It isn't even about who is knowledgeable. It's about who no longer has to prove anything. When method is removed, authority isn't rejected. It's inverted. Deference doesn't disappear. It changes direction. Instead of being granted through demonstrated competence, authority begins to attach to different signals: personality, confidence, familiarity, perceived independence. In the absence of shared standards, these traits become substitutes. This shift doesn't happen all at once. It emerges from a vacuum. Without an agreed method, there's no way to compare claims. Without accountability, there's no cost to being wrong. Without standards, there's no mechanism for correction. In that space, confidence starts to look like competence. Certainty starts to look like clarity. Dissent starts to look like bravery. Being an outsider becomes a credential. The less someone appears tied to institutions, the more authentic they seem. The more they reject established frameworks, the more independent they appear. And independence feels honest. This is where authority inversion becomes emotionally compelling. It feels anti-elitist. It feels empowering. It feels like thinking for yourself. It replaces trust in systems with trust in people, and that feels more human. But empowerment and methodological soundness are not the same thing. A claim doesn't become stronger because it's delivered confidently. A source doesn't become reliable because it feels authentic. Authority inversion doesn't eliminate authority. It simply assigns it without process. And that reassignment has consequences. Once authority is inverted, claims no longer need to be defended. Requests for evidence are reframed as submission to authority. Challenges are dismissed as indoctrination. Verification itself is treated as a failure of independence. The speaker is presumed credible by default, not because the claim has survived scrutiny, but because scrutiny itself is redefined as suspect. This isn't about intelligence. It isn't about bad faith. It isn't about being anti-science. It's about what happens when authority is assigned without method. When authority no longer rests on standards, the work of justification quietly shifts. Claims stop needing support. Questions start needing justification. And that's how the burden of proof flips.